Star Wars was an arcade game produced by Atari and released in 1983. The game is composed of 3D color vector graphics, giving it a unique style when compared to most games which use bitmap graphics. The player assumes the role of Luke Skywalker, as he pilots an X-Wing fighter from a first-person perspective. Unlike other arcade games of similar nature, the player does not have to destroy every enemy in order to advance through the game. He must simply survive as his fighter flies through the level. The ultimate goal of the game is to destroy the Death Star through 3 attack phases. In the first phase of the game, the player begins in outer space above the Death Star. The second phase has the player avoid tower attacks on the Death Star's surface. In the final scenario, the player must navigate the trench of the Death Star until finally firing proton torpedoes at the correct time for a direct hit on the exhaust port target. If the player is successful, the Death Star explodes and the player is awarded with a bonus shield, up to a maximum of 6. Should the player fail to hit the exhaust port, a shield is lost and the player must attempt the trench again. Once the trench stage is completed, the game restarts from the first phase. Each successive Death Star run greatly increases the difficulty.
Yahoo! You're all clear, kid!
So let's start off the ports with the Atari 2600 version. As you can see, it's recognisable as the Star Wars arcade game, just about. Sadly, it's nowhere near as playable. For some strange reason, you can't move and fire at the same time. This makes for very stiff gameplay and also ramps up the difficulty on later levels. Still, this is an Atari 2600, so we can't expect too much. Only slightly better than the 2600 port, this 5200 port suffers from not actually being able to navigate during the TIE Fighter sections, just like the 2600 port. Unlike that, however, you can now move the cursor and fire at the same time, making this version a little more playable. Nope, this isn't the Atari 5200 port again, but the Atari 8-bit liner computer version, such as the Atari 600XL and 800XL. This port is 100% the same as the 5200 version. Looking much nicer than any of the Atari console or Atari 8-bit computer ports, this Coleco Vision port does look promising. Sadly, it's also pretty lame when it comes to gameplay. Playing on the easy or normal settings doesn't even put up a challenge. The tower and trench sections can be played through by just holding down on the joystick, or down and left in the case of the tower section. Nothing will hit you at all. That's some lousy programming right there. This is the first of two Star Wars arcade ports to the Commodore 64. This version was released around 1983, early 1984, and is based upon the same port by the Parker brothers, which can be found on the Atari consoles and the Coleco Vision. Needless to say, it isn't very good. Well, that's unless you like shooting what looks like bow ties in space. In 1987, Vector Graphics developed a new version of Star Wars for the Commodore 64, using line graphics in an attempt to recreate the look of the original Vector Graphics, used in the arcade. In stills, this looks pretty good. However, in motion, it's painfully slow, resulting in a game that's barely playable. Domark published quite a few updated ports around 1987 and 1988, with this Amiga version being one of them. It really does look the part, apart from running in a lower resolution to the arcade game. The playability is also here, however, the controls are reversed. There's always got to be something wrong with an Amiga port. You see, Star Wars is one of those games where up should move you down and down should move you up. In this port, however, up moves up and down moves down. This just feels so wrong. Still, on the bright side, this port does feature much nicer voice samples than the arcade original.
1 in a million.
Jürgen Friedrich was the man behind the Amiga port and this Atari ST port, so it's funny to see that the ST port actually has the correct control system found in the arcade game. Personally, I also think the ST port has better graphics, looking much more like the vectors used in the arcade version. It's smoother too. In fact, it's a better port all round, besides the speech samples, which are awful.
I'm going in. That was 1 in a million.
After seeing the Commodore 64 port by Vector Graphics, I wasn't looking forward to the Amstrad CPC port. However, I needn't have worried. Sure, this port is rather slow, but it does feel quite smooth when playing. Rather nice for the CPC game. ZX Spectrum owners received a version of Star Wars based upon the Amstrad CPC port. It's pretty much the same game apart from running a little slower and having no sound at all, apart from the awful Star Wars theme tune during the loading screen. Now this is a first for Battle of the Ports, an Acorn Electron game. So how is this version? Well, apart from being just like the ZX Spectrum port in terms of speed, we do get a choice of colours for the graphics, as well as some rudimentary sound. I've opted for the red setting to give the game that Virtual Boy feel. The good old BBC Micro, a computer that every British person aged between 35 and 45 will know well, as it was the computer of choice for all schools in the UK. Considering how basic the BBC Micro games can be, this port is actually pretty good. It may not be the fastest of the 8-bit ports, but it does hold up well against the likes of the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC. Unlike the Western developed games, this Japanese game by MNM Software isn't really based upon the arcade game, but it is vector graphics based and does resemble the arcade port, so I've added it here. For those interested in viewing the entire intro in full, well, there's a link to it in the video's description. So the X68000 gets a more open Star Wars game that resembles the Sega Star Wars arcade game in terms of gameplay, although this came first. The aim of the first two stages is to take out a certain number of enemies before you can move on, rather than just surviving like the Atari arcade original. This leads to a much more frantic game and one that's pretty tough too.
I'm going in. Good boys, this is we're going in full throttle now to keep those spiders up our back. Right with you, boss.
And finally we finish up with the MS-DOS port, also by Vector Graphics. When running at regular speed, this port is a little jerky, but the beauty with PCs is that you can run games faster depending on your CPU, and that's just what we're doing here, resulting in a game that plays much closer to the arcade experience than any other home port. It's just a shame that there's no quality soundtrack. And let's take a look at all those versions of Star Wars running side by side.